All right, we're back with the BFG. Do you remember what happened? Do you know what the BFG stands for yet? Let's see if we can find out in chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3, the snatch. Under the blanket, Sophie waited. After a minute or so, she lifted the corner of her blanket to peer out. For a second time that night, her blood froze to ice and she wanted to scream, but no scream came out. There at the window, with the curtains pushed aside, was the enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face of a giant person staring in. The flashing black eyes were fixed on Sophie's bed. For the next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came snaking through the window. This was followed by an arm as thick as a tree trunk. And the arm, the hand, the fingers were reaching out across the room towards Sophie's bed. This time, Sophie really did scream, but only for a second, because the huge hand clamped down over her with the blanket, and the scream was smothered by the bed sheets. Ah! Sophie crouching underneath the blanket. She felt strong fingers grasping hold of her, and then she was lifted up from her bed, blanket and all, and whisked out the window. If you can think of anything more terrifying than that, happening in the middle of the night, then you should let me know about it. The awful thing was that Sophie knew exactly what was going on, though she couldn't see it happening. She knew that the monster, or giant, with an enormous long, pale, wrinkly face and dangerous eyes, had plucked her from her bed in the middle of the witching hour and was now carrying her through the window, smothered in a blanket. What actually happened next was this. When the giant had got Sophie outside, he arranged the blanket so that he could grasp all four corners of the blanket at once with his huge hands, with Sophie imprisoned inside. In the other hand, he seized the suitcase and the long trumpet, and he ran off. Sophie was squirming around inside the blanket, managed to push her head out the top so she could see just a little bit of the giant's head. She stared around her. She saw the village houses rushing by on both sides. The giant was sprinting down the high street. He was running so fast his black cloak was streaming out behind him. Streaming out behind him like the wings of a bird. Each stride he took was as long as a tennis court. Out of the village he ran, and soon they were racing across the moonlit fields. The hedges dividing the fields were no problem for this giant. He simply strode over them. A wide river appeared in his path. He crossed it in one flying stride. Sophie crouched in the blanket, peering out. She was being bumped against the giant's leg like a sack of potatoes. Over the fields and the hedges and the rivers they went, and after a while a frightening thought came into Sophie's head. The giant is running fast, she told herself, because he's hungry, and he wants to get home as quickly as possible. And then he'll have me for breakfast. Next chapter, the cave. The giant ran on and on, but now a curious change took place in the way he was running. He seemed suddenly to go into a high gear. Faster and faster he went as soon as he was traveling at such a speed that the landscape became blurred. The wind stung Sophie's cheeks. It made her eyes water. It whipped her head back and whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation that went flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were over land or sea. The giant had some sort of magic in his legs. The wind rushing against Sophie's face became so strong that she had to duck into the blanket to prevent her head from being blown away. Come here, Judah. Was it really possible that they were crossing oceans? Okay, 1 second. It certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket, come here, and listened to the howling of the wind. It went on for what seemed like hours. Then all of a sudden, the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked her head out through the blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally. Although normal was a silly word to use to describe a galloping giant, he leapt over dozens of rivers. He went rattling through a great forest, then down into a valley and up over the range of hills as bare as concrete. And soon he was galloping over the desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth. The ground was flat and pale yellow. Great lumps of blue rock were scattered around.
Mommy, can I tell you?
Hold on, not yet. And dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. The moon had long since disappeared, and now the dawn was breaking. Sophie, still peering out from the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her a great, craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around its sky was gushing and glistening with light. Bits of pale gold were flying among delicate, frosty white flakes of clouds. Don't worry, David. And over to one side, the rim of the morning sun was coming up red as blood. Right beneath the mountain, a giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. His great chest was heaving in and out. He paused to catch his breath. Directly in front of them, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone. It was as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as if it was a football. And now, where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large the giant didn't even have to duck his head when he went in. He strode into the black hole, still carrying Sophie in one hand, the trumpet and the suitcase in the other. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place so that the entrance to his secret cave was completely hidden outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside the cave. It was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away. Sophie sat in the dark, shivering with fear. He's getting ready to eat me, she told herself. He's probably going to eat me raw, just as I am. Or perhaps he will boil me first, or he will have me fried. He will drop me like a rash of bacon and some gigantic frying pan sizzling with fat. A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cavern and a high, rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and the shelves stood row upon row of glass jars. There were jars everywhere. They were piled up in the corners. They filled every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor,